If you want to pinpoint the exact moment a $5 million homeowners association signed its own legal death warrant, you don't need to dig through their corporate bank records. You just need to look at my front yard. Specifically, you need to look at my heirloom tomatoes. It is truly fascinating how much catastrophic destruction can sprout from a single, unauthorized vegetable. I am 72 years old. For the last 4 decades, I have lived in a modest, single-story cedar wood cabin sitting on a slightly overgrown corner lot. When I first built this house, the surrounding area was nothing but open dirt, pine trees, and silence. Today, it is known as Whispering Estates. It is a gated, highly restricted, aggressively manicured neighborhood filled with massive cookie-cutter mansions, imported grass, and people who care very deeply about the specific shade of beige painted on their neighbor's garage door. My cabin is the only old structure left. To the HOA, my home is not a piece of history. It is a visible infection on their perfect real estate portfolio. For years, they mostly just glared at me from across the street. But 3 months ago, a woman named Susan was elected as the new HOA president. Susan was the kind of woman who treated her volunteer neighborhood position like a military command. She had the clipboard, she had the sensible shoes, and she had an obsessive need to enforce arbitrary rules on people she deemed beneath her. From day one, she decided I was the ultimate target. It started with small, petty provocations. In my driveway sits a 1978 Ford pickup truck. It runs perfectly, but the paint is faded. Susan left a bright orange citation under my wiper blade, fining me $200 for storing an unsightly derelict vehicle in public view. I didn't argue. I simply threw the citation in my fireplace. A week later, she targeted my garden. I don't grow the approved, drought-resistant ornamental shrubs mandated by the community guidelines. I grow tomatoes. Big, sprawling, messy vines of tomatoes. Susan marched onto my property line, took 5 photographs from different angles, and sent me a formal cease and desist letter. She claimed my agricultural activities were attracting pests and severely damaging the property values of the modern homes around me. She called my garden trash. She called my house a shack. In my former career, before my hair turned white and I started spending my afternoons sitting on a porch swing, I was a civil engineer. I spent 40 years designing urban infrastructure. When you spend your life building the physical framework of cities, you learn to remain absolutely calm in the face of structural stress. You don't scream at a collapsing bridge. You just analyze the math. So, I didn't yell at Susan. I didn't hire a lawyer to fight her $50 tomato fines. I just watched her escalate her own arrogance. By the end of the month, Susan realized her fines were being ignored. So, she took the ultimate step. She convened an emergency board meeting and had their legal counsel draft a formal notice of foreclosure and eviction. A sheriff's deputy hand-delivered it to my wooden porch. The document stated that due to chronic violations and unpaid fines, the HOA was seizing my property to protect the neighborhood's standard of living. I had 30 days to vacate. Susan watched from the sidewalk, a smug, victorious smile plastered across her face. She thought she had finally crushed the old, vulnerable man in the corner shack. She made a very common, very fatal mistake. She looked at an old man in faded denim and assumed he was powerless. She assumed the homeowners association owned everything inside those iron gates. She didn't know 2 critical facts. First, I didn't know the HOA a single dime because my property wasn't actually part of their jurisdiction. And second, 40 years ago, I didn't just build my cedar cabin. I also designed and installed the main subterranean water and sewer lines that currently sit exactly 6 feet beneath her imported Italian marble driveway. 3 days after the eviction notice arrived, the heavy, diesel rumble of a commercial tow truck shattered the morning quiet. I was sitting on my porch, drinking black coffee, watching the yellow flashing lights bounce off the manicured lawns. Susan was standing at the edge of my driveway. She had her arms crossed, her posture rigid, looking incredibly pleased with herself. She was directing the tow truck operator toward my 1978 Ford. She wanted a spectacle. She wanted the whole neighborhood to look out their windows and see exactly what happens when you defy the homeowners association. Most people would have run outside screaming. They would have stood in front of the truck. They would have called the police, waving their arms and begging for someone to stop the theft. I took a slow sip of my coffee. In civil engineering, when you encounter a massive obstruction, you don't attack it head-on. You simply review the structural blueprints, locate the primary load-bearing pillar, and you remove it. Let gravity do the rest of the work. I stood up, gave Susan a polite, neighborly wave, and walked back inside my cabin. I didn't lock the door. I walked past the kitchen, down the short hallway, and into my study. In the corner sat a heavy, fireproof steel safe. I spun the dial, feeling the familiar, heavy clicks of the mechanism. Inside, beneath my birth certificate and my late wife's jewelry, was a thick, manila envelope. The paper was slightly yellowed, carrying the faint, dry smell of an old county archive. I pulled out the documents. These weren't community guidelines printed on glossy paper. These were the original 1984 plat maps, the master development agreements, and the deed to my land. When the developers bought the surrounding hundreds of acres to build Whispering Estates, I refused to sell my corner lot. To make their multi-million-dollar project work, they had to grant me a massive legal concession, a grandfather clause. My property was permanently, legally severed from any future neighborhood association. But more importantly, I pulled out the infrastructure easement agreement. Because the geography of the land sloped naturally toward my corner, the developers had to route the main water and sewer arteries directly through my property to connect to the city grid. I designed that system. I oversaw the pouring of the concrete. And in exchange, the county granted me a permanent, irrevocable utility easement. I retained absolute legal access and operational control over the master valves. I laid the old, hand-drawn blueprints on my dining table. Then, I opened the eviction packet Susan had sent me. Her packet included a brightly colored, modern map of the neighborhood, showing all the new property lines. I placed her modern map over my 1984 blueprint. I held them up to the morning light streaming through the window. I traced the thick blue line of the primary water main. It ran under the street, curved past the front gates, and cut directly through lot number 42. Susan's house. I adjusted my reading glasses and looked closer. The main, high-pressure water artery didn't just run under her grass. According to her own updated HOA map, Susan had just finished a massive $70,000 expansion of her luxury backyard swimming pool. The heavy concrete shell of her new pool was sitting directly on top of my legally protected, county-mandated utility easement. She had built a permanent structure over the neighborhood's main water line, completely blocking my legal right to access it. Outside, I could hear the hydraulic whine of the tow truck lifting my old Ford into the air. I didn't care. Susan was taking my truck. She had absolutely no idea I was about to take her pool. The community clubhouse was a monument to cheap construction disguised as luxury. It was filled with faux marble pillars that sounded completely hollow when you tapped them with a cane. I walked through the double glass doors at exactly 7 o'clock that evening, leaning slightly on my wooden walking stick. I didn't sit at the front. I took a seat in the very back row, surrounded by neighbors who shifted uncomfortably when I sat down. Susan was holding court at the front table. She had her wooden gavel. She had her perfectly arranged stack of glossy papers. She looked like a battlefield general about to announce a glorious victory to her troops. The agenda for the evening was displayed brightly on a projector screen behind her. Item number 4, final resolution on the eviction of Lot 0. When she reached my item, Susan stood up. She smoothed out her tailored skirt. She launched into a passionate speech about community standards, about preserving property values, and about how they had tolerated my unsightly shack and its feral garden for far too long. She told the room that my removal was a necessary surgical strike to protect the financial integrity of Whispering Estates. The other board members nodded along like obedient metronomes. I let her finish. In structural engineering, you always let the stress test run to its absolute maximum limit before you record the failure. You need to see exactly where the cracks form. When the room finally went quiet, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shake with anger. I simply walked down the center aisle, unrolling the heavy, yellowed 1984 County Master Blueprint as I approached her table. "Susan," I said, my voice carrying easily across the silent room, "before you vote to seize my property, you should probably check if you actually have any legal jurisdiction over the dirt it sits on." I laid the massive blueprint directly over her neatly typed agenda. "This is the original subdivision plat from 40 years ago. My property was grandfathered out of this HOA before the ink was even dry on your corporate charter. You don't own my land. You have never owned my land. Your eviction notice is legally equivalent to a child's crayon drawing." Susan stared at the old paper. Her eyes darted across the red county validation stamps and the notarized signatures. The extreme smugness vanished from her face, replaced instantly by a violent flush of panic. But arrogant people rarely retreat when they are cornered in public. They double down. "This is a forgery," she snapped, her voice pitching up an entire octave. "You printed this garbage off the internet. I am not playing these games with a delinquent old man. I am calling city code enforcement right now. We will have your property legally condemned by the city before midnight. She actually pulled out her phone and made the call on speakerphone right there at the table, demanding emergency intervention. She claimed a resident was presenting fraudulent legal documents and maintaining a severely hazardous structure. 20 minutes later, the heavy glass doors swung open. A large man in a crisp blue city code enforcement uniform walked into the room. Susan practically ran to him. She started pointing a manicured finger at me, listing my supposed crimes, demanding my immediate arrest and removal. The officer didn't look at her. He looked past her, straight at me. He stopped walking. A wide, genuine smile broke across his face. "Mr. Henderson?" the officer said, his voice echoing in the dead quiet room. "I haven't seen you since you retired. How have you been, boss?" I smiled back. "I've been well, Marcus. Though I seem to be having a slight zoning issue with my new neighbors." Marcus was a junior municipal inspector I had personally trained 25 years ago. He looked at Susan, who was standing there with her mouth hanging open, entirely paralyzed. Marcus walked over and reviewed the blueprints. He didn't just validate them. He announced to the entire HOA board that attempting to seize a grandfathered property was a massive civil violation. But Susan was beyond reason. Humiliation does terrible things to the human ego. Instead of apologizing, she slammed both of her hands on the folding table. "Fine. Keep your ugly shack," she screamed, abandoning all pretense of professionalism. "But your house is still connected to our private community grid. I am calling a board vote right now to permanently sever your water and sewer access. We will dry you out until you crawl away." She thought cutting off my water was her ultimate trump card. She had absolutely no idea she had just handed me the detonator. When a structure is pushed beyond its absolute failure point, it doesn't just crack. It shatters. Susan stood there, chest heaving, believing she had just delivered the ultimate death blow. She was going to cut off an old man's water supply. The room was dead silent. A few of the neighbors in the back row shifted uneasily, finally realizing that their HOA president had completely lost her mind. I looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at me. He actually winced, bracing himself for what he knew was coming next. I slowly rolled up my 1984 blueprint and placed it inside my leather tube. "Susan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying perfectly across the tense room. "You can't cut off my water. But you are absolutely right about one thing. The grid is compromised, and it needs to be shut down immediately." Her smug expression faltered. I turned to face the crowd of terrified homeowners. 40 years ago, when I designed the subterranean infrastructure for this entire valley, I routed the primary 72-inch municipal water main and the high-capacity sewer artery directly through my property. And then, it runs under Lot 42. I pointed my wooden cane directly at Susan. "Your property. Specifically, directly beneath the $70,000 unpermitted concrete swimming pool you just finished pouring last month. You built a massive, load-bearing concrete shell directly on top of a county-regulated, high-pressure utility easement." The color drained from Susan's face so fast, she looked like a ghost. "Marcus," I said, turning back to the code enforcement officer. "As a licensed civil engineer, I am officially reporting a class a structural hazard on a municipal easement. If that concrete cracks the main line, it will flood the entire subdivision with raw sewage within 12 minutes. Marcus didn't hesitate. "Understood, sir. I'll dispatch the emergency public works crew right now. We have to shut off the main valve at the street." Chaos erupted. 50 homeowners simultaneously realized what was happening. Shutting off the main valve didn't just cut off Susan. It cut off the entire $5 million Whispering Estates neighborhood. No water. No toilets. No showers. "Wait!" Susan shrieked, panic finally breaking her voice. "You can't turn off the water. How long until it's turned back on?" I walked toward the double doors, but I paused and looked back at her over my shoulder. "Until the hazard is removed, Susan. The county won't restore the water pressure until your $70,000 pool is completely demolished, excavated, and the easement is fully inspected. You have about 200 very thirsty neighbors. I highly suggest you rent a jackhammer tonight." I walked out into the cool evening air. The fallout was swift and absolute. By sunrise, the city had cut the water. By noon, the residents had staged a mutiny. They held an emergency recall vote on the sidewalk, immediately stripping Susan of her presidency and dissolving the current board. The city fined Susan heavily for building without proper easement clearance. The HOA's insurance refused to cover the demolition because the construction was illegal. She had to drain her life savings to hire an emergency excavation crew to tear her beautiful new backyard to pieces just so the neighborhood could flush their toilets again. A month later, a moving truck pulled up to lot 42. Susan quietly packed her things and left. I didn't go out to watch her leave. I was busy in my front yard. The weather was warming up perfectly, and my tomato vines were finally starting to bear fruit.